India Wins Freedom by Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. In the first elections held after the introduction of provincial autonomy, the Congress won an overwhelming victory. It secured about majority in 5 of the major provinces and was the single largest party in 4. It was only in the Punjab and Sindh that the Congress did not achieve comparable success. Gandhiji then went out to suspend the non-cooperation movement. This caused a severe political reaction in political circles and demoralized the country. The government took advantage of the situation and arrested Gandhiji. He was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment and the non-cooperation movement slowly petered out. About war in Europe. Gandhiji thought deeply over the question and ultimately suggested to Congress Working Committee that India must declare its stance in this international crisis. His view was that India must not participate in the war in any circumstances. Maulana Azad praised Gandhiji. It was a striking testimony to Gandhiji's wonderful capacity of finding solution to the most difficult of problems, that even in this impasse he had a formula which could meet the two opposite points of view. He had also a wonderful capacity of understanding and representing fairly a contrary point of view. The failure of the Cripps mission led to widespread disappointment and anger in the country. Many Indians felt that the Churchill cabinet had sent Sir Stafford only because of American and Chinese pressure, but in fact Mr. Churchill had no intention of recognizing Indian freedom. I may mention here that it was Gandhiji who first gave currency to the title Qaid-e-Azam or Great Leader as applied to Mr. Jinnah. Without pausing to consider the implication of his action, Gandhiji addressed Jinnah as Qaid-e-Azam. This letter soon after published in the press. When Indian Muslims saw that Gandhiji also addressed Jinnah as Qaid-e-Azam, they felt that he must really be so. When in July 1944 I read the report that Gandhiji was corresponding with Jinnah and going to Bombay to meet him, I told my colleague that Gandhiji was making a great mistake. His action would not help to solve, but on the contrary aggravate the Indian political situation. Later events proved that my apprehensions were correct. Jinnah exploited the situation fully and built up his own position. The Muslim League had gone so far in its demand for a separate independent state that it was difficult for it to retrace its steps. When I became aware that Lord Mountbatten was thinking in terms of dividing India and had persuaded Jawaharlal Nehru and Patel, I was deeply distressed. I realized that the country was moving towards a great danger. Partition of India would be harmful not only to Muslims but to the whole country. The differences related to the classes, not to groups. Once the country became free, Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs would all realize the real nature of the problem that faced them, and all communal differences would be resolved. I found that Patel was so much in favor of partition that he had hardly prepared even to listen to any other point of view. For 2 hours I argued with him. I pointed out that if we accepted partition, we could create a permanent problem for India. Partition would not solve the communal problem, but would make it a permanent feature of the country. Instead of removing communal fear, partition would perpetuate them by creating 2 states based on communal hatred. Once states based on hatred came into existence, nobody knew where the situation would lead. I was surprised when Patel in reply said that whether he liked it or not, there were 2 nations in India. He was now convinced that Muslims and Hindus could not be united into one nation. There was no alternative except to recognize this fact. In this way alone could we end the quarrel between Hindus and Muslims. I was surprised that Patel was now an even greater supporter of the two nation theory than Jinnah. Jinnah may have raised the flag of partition, but now the real flag bearer was Patel. I now turn to Jawaharlal. He did not speak in favor of partition in the way that Patel did. In fact, he admitted that the partition was by nature wrong. He had, however, lost all hopes of joint action after his experience of the conduct of the League members of the Executive Council. They could not see eye to eye on any question. Jawaharlal spoke to me in sorrow, but left no doubt in my mind as how his mind was working. It was clear that in spite of his repugnance to the idea of partition, he was day by day coming to the conclusion that there was no alternative. He recognized that partition was certainly not the best solution. In fact, it was not a good solution at all. Mr. Jinnah expressed the wish to meet Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. They met in Delhi, but the talks were inconclusive. This was not surprising. Once Congress had accepted partition, what future could there be for Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his party? The Mountbatten plan was based on the principle that the Muslim majority provinces should be separated and formed into a separate state. Muslims were in overwhelming majority in the frontier. As such, it was bound to be included in Pakistan. Geographically also, the frontier was within the proposed territories of Pakistan. In fact, it would have no point of contact with India. Many Pathans would prefer a small state of their own as they feared the domination of the Punjab. Lord Mountbatten was not, however, prepared to listen to any new demand. He wanted to push through his scheme as fast as possible, and the question of a free Pakhtunistan was not even discussed in detail. There were elements of comedy even in the midst of this great tragedy. There has been in Congress a group who have proposed as nationalists but are in fact utterly communal in their outlook. They have always argued that India has no unified culture and held that whatever Congress may say, the social life of Hindus and Muslims is entirely different. We accordingly announced that Lord Mountbatten was our choice for the Governor General. We expected the League to select him, but at the last moment, the League caused a surprise by proposing that Mr. Jinnah should be appointed the first General of Pakistan. I realized that these men had formed a picture of partition which had no relevance to the real situation. They had failed to realize the real implication of Pakistan. If the Muslim majority provinces formed a separate state, it was clear that the provinces in which the Muslims were in a minority would form part of India. Muslims of the UP and Bihar were a minority and would remain so even after a partition. Pakistan was formed. Muslims, whether they came from a majority or a minority province, would be regarded as a separate nation and would enjoy the right of determining their own future. Now, when the Muslim majority provinces went out of India and even Bengal and Punjab were divided and Mr. Jinnah left to Karachi, these fools realized that they had gained nothing but in fact lost everything by the partition of India. It was now clear to them that the only result of partition was that their position as a minority was much weaker than before. In addition, they had, through their foolish action, created anger and resentment in the mind of the Hindus. The joy was almost delirious, but lasted hardly 48 hours. The very next day, news of communal troubles began to cast deep gloom in the capital. It was the news of murder, death and cruelty. It was learned that in the East Punjab, Hindu and Sikh mobs had attacked Muslim villages. They were burning houses and killing innocent men, women and children. Exactly the same reports came from the West Punjab. Muslims were indiscriminately killing men, women, and children of Hindu and Sikh community. The whole of the Punjab, east and west, was becoming a graveyard of destruction and death. I have blamed Lord Mountbatten for the way in which he helped to bring about partition. I must now pay him a tribute for the manner in which he handled the crisis which faced us. I remember distinctly one occasion when the three of us were sitting with Gandhi ji. Jawaharlal said with deep sorrow that he could not tolerate the situation in Delhi where Muslim citizens were being killed like cats and dogs. He felt humiliated that he was helpless and could not save them. His conscience would not let him rest, for what answer could he give when people complained about this terrible happening? Jawaharlal repeated several times that he found the situation intolerable and his conscience would not let him rest. Mr. Jinnah and his followers did not seem to realize that the geography was against them. Indian Muslims were distributed in a way which made it impossible to form a separate state in a considerable area. The Muslim majority areas were in northwest and northeast. These two regions have no point of physical contact. People in these two areas are completely different from one another in every respect except religion. It is one of the greatest frauds on the people to suggest that religious affinity can unite areas which are geographically, economically, linguistically, and culturally different. It is true that Islam sought to establish society which transcends racial, linguistic, economic, and political frontiers. History has, however, proved that after the first few decades, or at the most after the first century, Islam was not able to unite all the Muslim countries on the basis of Islam alone.